All right, welcome back. So now we're going to talk about memory polarity. So it's basically we're talking about there's basically two different kinds of subconscious memory, right? Which is exactly what I say here. So there are two kinds of subconscious memory. Then I call them negative memory and positive memory, right? So just going over the last video, this is basically where you get the two effects of how more in one instance more memory can mean it's harder to charge, and in another instance more memory means it's easier to charge. So this is actually something that took me years to figure out, right? Not that that really matters now, but this was just something that took me a very long time to realize, and I didn't understand it until I finally recognized that transcendental states were intermittent, right? So where does negative memory and positive memory come from? What determines which kind is stored in your subconscious memory? Well, remember when we said about how your subconscious is always your subconscious memory is basically always storing information about your experiences. So it's just like your conscious mind and your subconscious mind's thoughts, right? You can't basically I said before that you can't turn them off for any amount of time. Like you have to think eternally, for all I know, right? You have to think with your conscious and subconscious mind. You can't stop it for any instant of time. So it's actually the same thing with subconscious memory, right? Your subconscious is always storing memory, no matter whether you want it to or not, right? It's going to do it, presumably, forever. Now, what's important is remember what we said about subconscious memory, right? Subconscious memory contains within it the experience you had at the time the memory was being stored or created. And it contains an association, right, or information about the experience you had. Now, and it's organized, your subconscious memory is organized according to the subject or point of focus, the thing you were focused on at the time of the experience. Now, remember what we also said, the memory, when a subconscious memory is accessed, right, your subconscious will actually revert back to the state it was in at the time you are focused on that subject. Now, we said that you can focus on a subject when your subconscious is in its ground state, but you can also focus on the subject when your conscious mind is in its transcendental state, right? So that's very important because the state your subconscious reverts to when that subconscious memory is accessed is going to be very different depending on whether you were in a normal state of awareness or in a transcendental state of awareness, because the subconscious is going to try to get your conscious mind to revert back to one of those states. So because of that, the subconscious memory has very different properties in terms of how it affects your conscious mind. So negative, just go over its next point, negative memory accumulates when you focus on subject while in a normal state of awareness, right? So in other words, if you focus on a subject while in a normal state of awareness and you're storing in that experience of subconscious memory, right? When you access that subconscious memory later, your subconscious is going to try to revert back to its ground state, right? So that your subconscious is in a normal state of awareness. And because your subconscious is trying to go back in its ground state, that's going to have a huge effect, right, on how your subconscious functions while you're focused on that subject, which has that kind of subconscious memory, right? Or has a subconscious memory that's trying to sort of stimulate your subconscious to go back to its ground state. So pretty much you can kind of get an idea of how subconscious memory functions and how it's going to affect your subconscious when you're accessing a subconscious memory. But for now, we'll still go over the properties. So as you would expect, negative memory or negative subconscious memory increases the subconscious tendency to stay in a ground state naturally. So this makes it harder to use your transcendental mental abilities, including experiencing emotion, right? So for example, if I'm focused on something that has a lot of negative memory, and what that means is that I've been focused on a subject for a lot of time or a long time while I'm in a normal state of awareness. So the subconscious memory is storing more and more experiences related to a normal state of awareness. Well, all those experiences have an accumulative effect, right? So when I access that subconscious memory, it'll more powerfully try to get my subconscious to stay in its ground state. Now remember, in a ground state, my subconscious isn't able to use transcendental mental abilities, right? So it's much harder. I shouldn't say it's not able, but it's very hard to, right? So I'm very limited in my ability to produce emotion or transcendental imagination or transcendental control and creativity and so on and so forth. So the more negative memory or the more experiences I have with some subject in a normal state of awareness, the harder it's going to be for me to experience emotion and charge up, in other words. This is actually where things get old, which we're going to talk about more in the next video. But when things get old, right? So if I'm listening to a song, right, and if I listen to a song and I'm in a normal state of awareness, if I keep being in a normal state of awareness the whole time I'm listening to a song, a lot of negative memory is going to accumulate, and it's going to be very hard for me to feel any emotion while I listen to it, right? When I was talking about with boxing and AJ or Anthony Joshua, and I said that he has a harder time, as he got more experience in his career and as he grew older, he had a harder time entering a transcendental state. That's because of this property, right? So I'd said that he was trying to control the match or control what's going on in his mind and in the ring in terms of his physical abilities. He's trying to stay too much in control when he's fighting. All of that control represents a normal state of awareness because you don't have control like that in a transcendental state of awareness. And we're going to talk about that here too. Now, but remember what I said, in transcendental state of awareness, it almost feels like a daydream, right? You don't feel like you're super in control in a dream, right? You feel like that when you're in your normal state of awareness going about your regular day. So Anthony Joshua, as he tries to lean more into so much control, he's producing an intention, and his brain is responding to that intention in a way that's keeping his subconscious in its ground state. And as he keeps boxing with constantly trying to exert that sort of intense degree of control, right, the subconscious stays more in its ground state. So the longer he does that, the more negative subconscious memory is accumulating relative to the subject or the experience or event of boxing, right? And as he kept doing that more and more and more, right, he developed more and more negative memory, and he had a harder time entering a transcendental state or reaching a transcendental level of performance, right? And if that doesn't make a lot of sense or it's hard to imagine it, just watch AJ's career, right? You're gonna watch him in the beginning fights, and not just when he fought the amateurs, right? So they're professionals, but they're amateurs in the sense that they didn't have a lot of experience and they didn't have a great record, right? But even when he fought the more experienced people, like Dillian Whyte, you can see the way he fought. Dillian Whyte, Klitschko, like you can see the way he fought was much more transcendental. He fought with much more emotion, much more passion, right? The way he moves his body, right? You could tell it had the transcendental control. And when you watch him fight in his later fights, you can see that he's moving much more stiff. He doesn't move as smooth, as natural. He's not moving with instinct, right? Because your subconscious level, when you fight with your subconscious, you're just going to fight using instinct. You're not going to think about it that much. You're just going to do it, right? So everything with your subconscious is just doing it, right? And you can see he's not doing that. Everything he does is super calculated, super premeditated. That's all negative-minded thinking. And so basically what I'm getting at is that he developed more negative memory, and that suppressed his ability to use transcendence or reach a transcendental level of performance. So that's basically what negative memory always does. The more negative memory accumulates for relative to some experience or something you're focused on, or it could be some activity, but still mainly something you're focused on, the harder it's going to be to feel emotion, and the harder it's going to be to reach a transcendental level of performance. Now, the other property of negative memory is that it actually makes your mind feel more stable. So that's a positive property, right? Technically, it's all positive because you don't want to have too much positive memory either, which we're going to talk about that later. But basically, if your subconscious is charged too much, right, it's going to, like I said in the beginning, your compulsions will feel too strong and you'll feel all over the place. So you need both, right? But yeah, so negative memory makes your mind feel more still and more stable, which is a property of the ground state, right? That's what your brain's supposed to do. So it just basically means it's easy for you to use the logic and rationality. You don't feel like your thoughts are racing all over the place and you can't control them. which you feel when you're in a very emotional state. So going over to the next point, we're now going to talk about the opposite of negative memory, which is positive memory, right? So where does positive memory come from? Well, as you can, I think I already said it actually, when you're focused on some subject, or which, like I said, could be a place, person, place, or thing, but when you're focused on some subject in a transcendental state of awareness, then that experience and the information about the state your subconscious is in, which is an excited state during that time, gets stored to subconscious memory. So when you focus on that same subject later, your subconscious that subconscious memory gets accessed, and then it tries to revert back to an excited state. So if you keep focusing on some subject while in a transcendental state of awareness, which gets a little difficult for reasons we'll get into in the next chapter. In the next video. But if you keep focusing on something while in a transcendental state of awareness, then those experiences accumulate in the subconscious memory. And they start to sort of have a combining effect of boosting your subconscious ability to sort of revert back to a transcendental state, right? So when something has a positive memory, it actually gets easier to enter a transcendental state, and it gets easier to charge energy. And in fact, this is actually what it means to charge your subconscious. So when you're charging your subconscious, what it means is that a subconscious memory is becoming more and more and more positive, right? Which is another way of saying the energy component of the memory is becoming more intense. And that will happen if you have more and more and more experiences with some subject while your mind was in a transcendental state. So that's actually what it means for something when your subconscious charges up. It just means that some subconscious memory is becoming more positive. So as an example, so I gave the example previous video, if I have a crush on a girl, right? So if I have a crush on a chick, right? And let's say every time I see her, right, I keep thinking of all these thoughts, all these lovey-dovey thoughts that make me feel more of the love emotion. If I keep feeling that every time I focus on her, then it's going to grow more and more and more intensely, right? Now, there's a reason that you might not normally see that happen, and that's what we're going to talk about next video. And in chapter 11, we're going to learn how to actually do that, so it just keeps growing more intensely. But if you did something like that, then yes, it would just keep growing endlessly, right? Because the memory would get more and more and more positive. Now, positive memory also has its own properties, which are pretty much just the opposite of negative memory. But, so like I said here, positive memory increases the subconscious tendency to go back to its excited state. So it's going to be very easy. The more positive memory something has, in other words, the more charged your subconscious is relative to some subject. So I think I should mention that now. Whenever your subconscious charges up, right, it's always going to be relative to some point of focus. So like I said, if I have a crush on a girl, then my subconscious is charged at the love frequency relative to her. So I have to focus on her to access that charge, or access that emotional energy, or access that subconscious charge. So if I focus on something else or some other person who doesn't have that subconscious memory in my subconscious, I won't feel those feelings anymore, right? So if I focus on the girl, I feel all that emotion. If I focus on anyone else, my emotion level drops, right? So I don't feel very much, right? So in order to access that charge, I have to stay focused on her. Then I'll feel all that emotion and that rush of emotional energy. So charge is always related to a subject, right? You always access that charge when you're focused on a subject. If I'm very creative, right? So if I'm in a very creative state, or I charge my subconscious to use creativity, let's say for the purpose of conversation, right? If I'm not in a conversation, we'll talk more about it later in chapter 13, but you can even charge your subconscious to be great at conversation with a specific person, right? So if I talk to someone else, or I'm not in a conversation, then I won't have access to that charge, right? I won't just be able to converse very easily. But when I focus on that particular person again, let's say your best friend, you'll notice you could talk very easily and have a conversation very easily, right? So the subconscious charge is always related to a specific subject. And that'll make a little more sense when we talk about how transcendental performance in chapter 13. But it's much easier to understand for now in terms of emotion. But just to go over these properties more, so this part's obvious. So now the thing we didn't mention about positive memory is that positive memory, because it's related to subconscious charge, right? It has a frequency and an energy. Well, it has an energy component, right? So the energy component charges and it also discharges. So we're actually going to talk about how discharging works from the perspective of subconscious memory in a later video, not this one. I think there's one other thing I want to go over first, which I go over in the book before I talk about that. But yeah, so subconscious memory or positive subconscious memory has an energy component which could be built up, so the memory becomes more and more positive, but then it can also discharge, and the memory becomes more and more, less and less positive. There's technically a discharging, something as similar to discharging with negative memory, but we're going to talk about that later too. But yeah, so positive memory has a component of energy and therefore also a component of frequency. So positive memory has a frequency component. The frequency of negative memory is always just a ground state. So that's not really a frequency in the normal way we defined it. But if you had to give it one, it's just a ground state. So whatever the brain is charging your subconscious to do, right? So negative memory is always related to the ground state. Positive memory has a frequency component because the conscious mind is the one that's charging it. And that's going to be related to your intention. Now, also, positive memory also has the component of subconscious action, right? So in other words, so remember what I said, when you access the subconscious memory, your subconscious tries to revert to the same state it was in, when the experience in the memory was being stored. Now, what that state also includes is information about the action your subconscious was expressing. So for example, if you're charging your subconscious, let's say you're watching a movie, right? You're charging your subconscious through the reflection principle in a way where it's expressing itself or it's expressing some story or some scenario fantasy based on the movie you're watching. So later, right, when you focus on that movie again, you might feel compelled to tell the same kind of story or engage in the same type of actions. So just as an example, when I was a kid, right, you go watch a superhero movie, right? And then later, when you leave the theaters and you think about the superhero movie, you might feel like you're a superhero and you might want to save people and things like that. So you're inspired by the movie. But what's really happening is your subconscious charged in the manner of expressing or kind of creating the story and imagining yourself and fantasizing about being a hero, just like what the movie did. So the subconscious action sort of repeated itself. The subconscious action was similar to the same subconscious action that was being performed when the experience was being stored. So that's important too. So in other words, positive memory contains information about the subconscious action you were performing at the time and how you were expressing that subconscious action. So this part's kind of obvious. It pretty much is what I just said about subconscious action, but positive memory generally causes you to feel more emotion. So you feel emotion very easily and very strongly, and that emotion is related to the frequency associated with the positive memory. So as positive memory gets more and more positive, you're going to feel emotion more and more strongly. So that's the opposite, obviously, of negative memory. As the memory gets more and more negative, right, you're going to have a harder and harder time feeling any emotion, right? And the last property I want to talk about here is positive memory. As it gets more and more positive, it makes your mind feel more like it's in motion. And the reason for that is basically what I was saying before about compulsion. So as positive memory gets more and more positive, then the subconscious is charging more and more relative to the subject associated with that positive memory. And when you access that positive memory, right, and you access all of the energy stored in that subconscious memory, your subconscious will start compelling you very strongly. And you'll enter a transcendental state very easily, right? And when you do, your subconscious instinct is kind of going to not really take over, but it becomes much more pronounced because it's compelling you more strongly. And you start to feel more like you're in a daydream, right? So when you're in a daydream, your thoughts are all over the place. They don't feel stable like when you're not in a daydream and you're just going about your waking day, which that's a normal state of awareness. So as a subconscious memory gets more positive, It makes you feel more like you're in a daydream and like your thoughts are racing all over the place, right? So it feels just more like your mind and your attention's constantly in motion. And you notice this once again when you're in a very emotional state. It's hard to keep your mind still, right? And just kind of focus and relax and think one thing and focus on that one thing. No, when you're in a very emotional state, your mind's racing and constantly thinking about something related to whatever's making you feel very emotional. So positive memory makes your mind feel much more in motion, and negative memory makes your mind feel very stable, very relaxed, very controlled, right? Provided your brain is sort of working properly or ideally, right? So that's pretty much it. That's positive memory. I actually forgot to mention, I mixed, I think, the next 3 sections in the book. They were short, so I could put them in one video. But yeah, so this is very important. So your mind has polarity. Your subconscious memory has polarity. There are 2 types of memory, negative and positive. And you really want to get an idea of whenever you're charging your subconscious and you're focused on some subject or some particular point of focus. When you want to access that charge, you're going to start to get an intuitive sense, right, of how negative the memory is becoming and how positive the memory is becoming, right? And you kind of want to know, which memories are negative and which are positive, because that's going to tell you how your subconscious is going to respond. So I kind of think about this all the time. It's going to make more sense once you actually start charging your subconscious, because then you're definitely going to have to think in these terms. But for now, you just want to kind of get a sense of how these 2 memory types work, right? In the next video, we're going to go back to the aging problem. Then we're going to talk about it in these terms. Once again, we're going to talk about a phenomenon I call subconscious entropy, which is very similar to entropy in physics, right? And that'll, once again, tell us why things get old, right? So yeah, that's it for now, but thanks for watching, and I'll see you next video.